It's time to find out
What Shane said
with Shane Manila.
Hey, happy Thanksgiving. If you celebrate Thanksgiving, if you don't, happy Thursday or whatever holiday you might celebrate on Thursdays. That's cool. Either way, it's time for another Shane Says episode because that's what we do here on Thursdays. We do Shane Says episodes. So I'm going to do one today about one of my favorite topics, selling low on players. I didn't say buy low. I said selling low. I know fantasy and dynasty community, we talk a lot about buying low, selling high. I don't think those terms are particularly accurate, or I should say, I don't think those are axioms or truisms that we should always follow. I do believe that we should sell low on players, not every player, obviously, but players that we have a reason to believe that their value is not going to bounce back, right? I think when people talk about buying low on a player, they presuppose or they assume that that player that they're buying low on, one, their value is going to increase at some point, or the production for that player is going to bounce back, or it's going to improve. Otherwise, why would you be buying low on a player? I don't assume you would be buying low on a player just to add a non-producing player to your roster. That would be kind of silly. So yeah, when you're buying low on a player, again, you're assuming that player's going to increase in value or their production is going to increase. I assume you're going to assume that they're going to at least recoup their value, right? So at worst, maybe you could then turn around and flip that player for the exact same thing you bought it for, which is a perilous assumption anyway. I don't know if I used the word perilous correctly there, but I felt like using it, so I tried it. And if it's right, let me know. If it's not, whatever. So anyway, that's just an assumption that I feel is wrong, right? A lot of times when you're buying low on a player, you are buying an asset, obviously, that is going to, not always, but there's oftentimes you're going to buy a player that's going to continue their downward spiral. Their production is not going to bounce back. And their value is also not going to increase or hold. So you've essentially bought a wasted asset, something that you can't even use in your roster and something that you can't move. Oftentimes, like I said, you're buying them thinking that you're getting them at the lowest level that they're going to be, at their lowest peak. That's the opposite of what I'm looking for. You're buying them expecting some production bounce back. You're expecting that they're at least going to plateau, right? They're not going to continue to dip and continue to crash. But a lot of times players, once they start the spiral of badness, non-production, loss in value, a lot of times that continues. So there's a couple players that I wanted to talk about today that I think fit that criteria. Now, before we go further with that, I want to say that I think buying low on specific players, archetypes, I should say, is probably a bad idea, right? Aging players, obviously players that are getting older, their value, it's going to take a lot for their value to ever increase after the age of, let's say, 30 for a wide receiver. It's almost near impossible for their value to increase, even if their production were to normalize. It's also probably a bad idea to buy low on players that have never produced, right? That their value has always been based on speculation, but they've never matched that speculation, or at least hit those speculative heights. Before we get to those players, though, I did just want to remind everyone, I hope you don't have trade deadlines. If you do, hopefully you still have some time to make some moves before they start. Hopefully it's right before the playoffs is when they begin. Go ahead out there, and you should be still trying, assuming you're competing. You should be trying to sell your Rashid Shaheed, your Brandon Ayuk, your Christopher Godwins, right? I assume you tried to sell those players when they first got injured, and maybe you weren't able to. Obviously, if I'm talking to you specifically and they're still on your rosters, you weren't able to. A lot has changed in the last few weeks. 3 weeks ago, there's teams that are now out of it that thought they were still in it 3 weeks ago, but time has a way of changing things. 3 weeks ago, you might have been competing, not you, but the person you're trying to deal with. The person you were with might have been competing, but they've lost 3 games in a row. They've lost 1 of 2, or they've just come to the cold reality that the math just isn't there for them. You know, they need to win 4 out of the last 6 games. I'm assuming median, and they're just not, they're just not on that road to playoffs. You looked at Dynasty Daddy's playoff projections, and it has them at a 10% rate. All that to say, you should be trying to move Brandon Ayuk. You should be trying to move Rashid Shaheeds, Chris Godwin's, etc. Those injured players. For players like Bucky Irving, Chase Brown. These are running backs that I particularly like, especially Bucky Irving, but Chase Brown as well, I guess, are players that I think can have a little more utility than just this season. What I do like, too, about Bucky Irving and Chase Brown, assuming you don't have a trade deadline. If you don't have a trade deadline, if you make a move for these players and say somehow you don't make the playoffs, say something unfortuitous happens and you just crash out of the playoffs, you can probably flip them. Not probably, you can flip them for at least what you traded for them or gave up. And if you don't have a trade deadline, once the playoffs end, once your playoff run ends, if you're not the champion, if that ends before the championship game, you can move them. Just this week, bring up my own examples of trades. I moved Brandon Ayuk for Bucky Irving. Specific to that league, I have an outside chance of making the playoffs. I'm okay if I get stuck with Bucky Irving going into next year, but I would not be opposed to moving Bucky Irving in 2 weeks if I'm out of the playoffs, or in 4 weeks if I'm still out of the playoffs, but someone else comes knocking. There's a world where I think you could still get I think you could get a first for Bucky Irving or Chase Brown, even if you have to add a little to them, even if you had to add, say, like a third or a second or whatever. So anyway, make sure you're doing that. All right. First player that I'm telling you to sell low on. This is a player that if you watch Wake Up, and you should listen to Wake Up with Ray GQ and Jay Rich, they've been talking about him a lot lately. Anthony Richardson reinstalled as the starter in Indianapolis. Right now, Anthony Richardson is the QB 17 on KTC. He's already seen his value drop from the beginning of the year. He was the QB 7 to start the season, QB 17. For obvious reasons, he's been benched, right? And his production has absolutely been horrendous. I'm just going through his game logs, and I'm going to count because that's good radio. I've got 4 full games out of 7 where he ended with less than 200 passing yards. Now, if he was running for, 75, 80, 85 yards a game, okay, cool. But he's not doing that. He has a 11-11 touchdown ratio in his career. Let's see. He's thrown 11 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. That's a 1-to-1 ratio. That is bad. I am not a quarterback guru. I do not pretend to be, but that is bad for the quarterback position. You generally don't want them throwing the same amount of interceptions as you do touchdowns. Think of Jameis, 30 for 30. A-Rich is like the poorer version of that, right? He's the 11-11 guy over 2 years. He has a career 50.9 completion percentage. That is absolutely atrocious. I can't even think of all the adjectives that I want to use. It's bad, right? And he's actually regressed this year. Entering the season, last year, he had a 59.5 completion percentage. This year, it's down to 47.1. In 4 of 8 games, including his injured game, in 4 of the 8 games that he's played, he's had a sub 50% completion percentage. And in 3 of those games, it's actually been below 45%. That is historically bad. Okay. But despite that, despite him being benched, despite him playing poorly, despite him not being really good at football and not a fantasy asset, there is still meat on that bone. You can still get legitimately good football players, fantasy players for him. I just jumped in on Dynasty Daddy. Just take a look, see what type of players we can get, right, for Anthony Richardson. This was today. This is a super flex. This is actually a 2 QB league. It's super flex. 2 QB league. Start 10, 12 teams. Someone gave up Malik Neighbors and a 4th round draft pick for Anthony Richardson, which is just absolutely bananas to me. I can't believe someone would do that, but it's been done. So don't tell me that it can't be done when I've seen that it's been done, right? Another deal, which is less less insane, but still not great. Someone gave up Anthony Richardson and Deebo Samuel for Drake London. Smash that Drake London side, please. Some other deals. Let's see. We've got Brian Robinson and Anthony Richardson for Brock Purdy. Even with Brock Purdy's injury to his shoulder, I would still absolutely smash the Brock Purdy side. Absolutely ridiculous. Another deal, someone gave up a 26 first, 26 second, and Cade Stover. All right, Cade Stover for Anthony Richardson. Give me the pick sides, man. Here, someone else cashed out 25 first for Anthony Richardson. Here's another one. Someone gave up J.J. McCarthy and got Anthony Richardson in a second. Other way around. They gave up Anthony Richardson in a second for J.J. McCarthy. So there are a lot of outs right now. You might have to be creative. You might have to go cross-positional. But don't tell me that you can't get out on Anthony Richardson. You can get out. If you want to get out on him now. And a good corollary or a good lesson, I guess, learned is if you look at Justin Fields, right? There were pockets of time where you could have gotten out on him and you didn't. You were given multiple windows. I don't know how many more windows you're going to get with Anthony Richardson. I'd suggest you go ahead and make that move right now. Anthony Richardson, sell him low before it even gets lower. Next guy. This pains me. This really does pain me. Really, really, really pains me a lot. Tyreek Hill. Love Tyreek Hill. Had Tyreek Hill on a bunch of teams. Really, really thought that this would be a good season for Tyreek, and I was incorrect, right? So far, Hill is averaging 11.7 points per game this year. He's the wide receiver 39, excuse me. Wide receiver 13 wouldn't be that bad. He's actually the wide receiver 39, scoring 11.7 points per game. And you could blame it all on Tua, right? The fact that the Tua was out multiple games, which is true. That hurt his numbers. Since he's been back in the 5 games, since Tua's been back, Tyreek Hill is averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game. That is a low-end wide receiver 2 at best. I'm not even going to bother to look it up. It is not a wide receiver 1 for damn sure. It is not a high-end wide receiver 2 at best. It's a low-end wide receiver 2, and it's probably lower than that. I don't feel like looking it up. You could tell me if I'm wrong. But yeah, Tyreek Hill, unfortunately, even with the return to it, he hasn't bounced back, man. He hasn't. There's a couple reasons for that, right? Before we move on and get into that, there's a couple reasons for that. Miami's offense is a little different than it has been in the past. So they've incorporated a tight end, Juno Smith, and you can laugh at Juno Smith if you want to, right? But in the 11 games that Juno Smith has been a Miami Dolphin this year, he has more receiving yards than any other Miami player has had in the previous seasons with Tua and Waddle. With Waddle and Tyreek Hill, and that's per ESPN. So in the last, the 2 seasons prior to this, Tyreek and Waddle had over 1,000 yards each, and then the next leading receiver had something like 400 yards. Juno Smith has already surpassed those numbers, so he is absolutely incorporated into that offense. They're not an explosive team anymore, Miami, right? And that's where Tyreek makes his money, at least from fantasy perspective. They're just not an explosive team. They have 124 explosive plays last year. That was 7.29 explosives per game. This year, through the first 10 games, they had 58, which is 5.8, which is almost, 1.5. And it seems like a small margin, but it's small margins that make fantasy players elite or not elite, or even good in this case. Tua's pass attempts, his air yards, his attended air yards, that's dropped this year as well. Last year, he was averaging about 7.9 intended air yards per attempt. This year, it's closer to 5.5. So it's not good, right? So like I said, the offense has changed. Hill is also how he's being used, not just how the team is, the offense is. He's being used differently. He's averaging 11.7 yards per reception this year compared to 15.1 last year. Last year, he was averaging something north of 10 targets per game, 10.7. This year, it's down to 6.7. His air yards, his share of air yards, team share of air yards has dropped from 44% to 38%. Obviously, he's not as good as he used to be, right? He's dropped from the beginning of the year from wide receiver 13 to wide receiver 25 on KTC. Now, even if Tyreek Hill were to see a spike in his production, it's very unlikely that he'll see a very, very highly unlikely that he would see a correlating or corresponding spike in his value. He's going to be 31 at the start of next season. So I wanted to just take a look at a wide receiver in that age range that used to be elite around the same time last year. Devontae Adams. Last year at this time, Tyreek this time next year will be the same age that Devontae Adams is right now. Devontae Adams is 31.9 years old. Tyreek Hill will be 31.7. So last year, Adams finished as the wide receiver 15.6 points per game, which is much better than what Hill's doing, right? He's outscoring him by 4 points per game. And he fell from the wide receiver 28 at the end of last season to the wide receiver 36 by the start of the season. He dropped, even though he had a much better season than Tyreek Hill is doing. Tyreek Hill is having a bad year. So for Tyreek Hill to see a spike in value, he'd have to go out there, outproduce what Devontae Adams did last year. Follow me here with the timeline. Basically, Tyreek Hill would need to go out there and put up, let's say, even if he put up 16 points per game, his value is not going to increase. It's likely he'd need to put up somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 points per game again before his value would increase. Just to that Devontae Adams point, if Hill were to continue to crater, which Adams has done this year, he could continue to fall, and like Adams has, and Adams has fallen to the wide receiver 55 right now. So Hill's going to be 32 shortly. He'll be 31 soon, beginning of next season. His production's dropped. He's obviously not going to go get better. It's just, that's not how it works. Even if his production bounces back, he's not going to see a value spike. And again, I practice what I preach. I actually made a deal moving Tyreek Hill and Kirk Cousins, a couple elderly aging assets that aren't very liquid. And what I moved them for is two assets that have a little more fungibility than Cousins and Hill. I traded them for George Pickens, who is the wide receiver 14 on KTC as of this week. And he's just 23 years old. And a 2025 first. Way I looked at it in my brain, Pickens for Hill straight up, more than good with that, and then a 25 first for Kirk Cousins. So like I said, I was able to move two unfungible assets, maybe that's a word, for two assets with more liquidity. And in the 2025, specifically in the picks case, I have an asset that I know will increase in value over the next several months prior to the draft, up until the rookie draft. So these deals can be made, right? So again, I just wanted to go ahead and jump on Dynasty Daddy to see what deals are out there for Tyreek Hill. Obviously, you're not going to be you can't always make the exact deals I made, but I decided, let me go see. One trade I didn't like is someone got Romeo Dubs for Tyreek Hill. For that, I'll just hold on. But I saw another person here. They got a 25, 26 firsts, a 25 and a 26 first, as well as a 26 second and a 26 third. Bananas, take it and run. Another deal, 25 first for Tyreek Hill. Absolutely have to make that deal. Another deal, T. Higgins for Tyreek Hill. Absolutely have to make that deal. Another person traded Tyreek Hill, James Cook, and a 26 second for Nico Collins and Tyler Algier. If that isn't two ships passing in the night with Hill and Nico Collins, I don't know what is. Another deal, 25 first and Trey Benson for Tyreek Hill. These deals can be made. I understand the urge to hold on to players that we have some affinity for, understanding that you want to hold on to players that have given you production in the past, or you at least thought were going to give you production, like Anthony Richardson. The ceiling. Ceiling's likely not going to get hit with Anthony Richardson, not at this point, not based on what he's done so far. Tyreek Hill, even if he were to start giving you increased production again, his trade value is never going to increase. It's just not. That's not how it works. 31-year-old wide receivers coming off a down season do not increase in value. And at this point, there's already anchoring bias at that. So even if Tyreek Hill went out there and smashed for the last 4 weeks of the season, what people are going to remember is the first 11 games of the year when he didn't smash. One thing, though, if you do still like these players, you can buy back on them. You can definitely buy back on them. Trade them now, make the profit now. And if you want to, in 4 months, when Tyreek Hill again is about to turn 31, it's the offseason and he's not scoring points, that's when he's going to be cheaper. Anthony Richardson, he's going to continue to crash. I wouldn't suggest buying him, but sure, if you can trade him now for one of those packages I talked about that I saw in Dynasty Daddy and then buy him later for a third, sure. Low risk, low reward. So that's it. I just had 2 players that I wanted to talk about that I'm all in on selling low. Who are your sell lows? Tell me who your sell lows are in the comments. And one other thing, if you like the show, please subscribe, hit the like button. Those things help the channel. Got to make sure you're subscribed to DD. If you are not a patron member, if you haven't subscribed to the website, hit me up. I got a discount code. Even if you don't hit me up, just sign up. It's a great site. We got lots of tools, lots of premium content. So appreciate everybody. I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll talk soon.